Perched at the head of Taunton Bay in Hancock County, Franklin, Maine, was an East Coast settlement with a frontier personality. Founded in 1764, its soil was harsh and rocky, making farming difficult and only yielding results after the undertaking of backbreaking work. What it lacked in natural agricultural productivity, it made up for in its strong, densely wooded areas, allowing for a handful of sawmills to coexist without any local tensions, producing lumber for buildings, ships and railroad sleepers. Throughout the colonial era, shipmasts were a solid source of trade across Maine, and sawmills took advantage of the tall pines to secure contracts with the British Navy, allowing for industry to grow and flourish. Sooner rather than later, however, the independent spirit of frontier, along with a host of political disagreements and social tensions, led residents to push back against the British monopolisation of ship lumber and eventually to revolution. Following the revolution, Franklin was a settlement like many other in Maine. Its farmers watched the incoming unpredictable winters with anxiety. The land was cheap, but the living could certainly be rough, with predators, difficult soil, harsh frosts, pest infestations and drought, just a fraction of the hurdles that kept many holdings at subsistence levels. Religion gained traction through a myriad of revivals and evangelical preachers who sought to bring new forms of worship to the Congregationalist majority, from Quakers to Methodists, as well as a newfound interest into the exploration of the divine, paving the way for the spiritualist influx during the 19th century. Franklin was then, like any other frontier settlement in North America, at once small and tightly knit, a place where shouldering your neighbour's burdens was as important as personal prosperity, yet fractured and socially complex. Set in this landscape of an unforgiving, uncertain future, the story of Nelly Butler begins. David and Joanna Hooper had married and settled in East Franklin, Maine during the latter half of the 18th century. David Hooper had fought in the American Revolution, and now a veteran, he set about family business with Joanna Hooper, who birthed 9 children in the 9 years from 1775 to 1784. The second of these children was a girl named Eleanor, who was born on the 25th of April 1776. She was known locally as Nelly, and at the age of 19 she met George Butler, a young sea captain whose father, Moses, had also fought in the American Revolution and was regarded as one of the first English settlers of Franklin. They owned a sawmill and their family was generally well-to-do. The pair married and lived together on Butler Point in Franklin, a heavily wooded area lying on the eastern banks of Egypt Bay. 2 years after their marriage, Nelly fell pregnant. However, she became the unfortunate victim of a complicated childbirth and died on the 13th of June 1797, less than a day after the passing of her newborn baby. She was buried on Butler Point in an unmarked grave. For the now widowed George Butler, life stood relatively still for a few years, until the winter of 1799 fell across Maine, bringing with it not only bleak, cold nights, but also a rather peculiar and controversial series of events that would see his life flipped upside down and seemingly caught in a cycle of union and loss. The Blaisdell family was headed by Abner Blaisdell, another veteran of the American Revolution. He married Mary Card, but after her untimely death, he remarried Mary Simpson, and the Abner couple established themselves in Sullivan, Maine, a small settlement lying 10 miles to the southeast of Franklin on the eastern side of Taunton Bay. It was a tight-knit rural community that consisted of only around 20 families. Just like Franklin, it too thrived on the shipbuilding economy and had several mills powered by the streams that forked and spidered throughout the area. Abner and Mary Blaisdell had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. The first girl was named Hannah and was born in 1780, and the second, Lydia, was born 5 years later in 1785. The Blaisdell house was situated in the north of the town on a 100-acre farm plot, and Lydia and Hannah spent their days sorting and picking cotton fleece in the cellar of their family home. Like many at the time, Abner was a religious man, and the family followed in step, praying together and seeking to live their lives right in the eyes of God. As the harsh, bleak winter of 1799 fell upon Sullivan, Lydia Blaisdell, almost 15 years of age, found herself in a severe struggle against a form of pestilence. Sick and lying in bed, her immune system was succumbing to a disease that held no prisoners and could very easily have taken her life. It was during this time of struggle that the first of several unusual encounters would occur in the Blaisdell farmhouse. Coming from the cellar, Lydia heard a series of knocking sounds. After a search of the cellar was conducted and no origin was found, Abner called the family together to pray, ensuring that whether or not the sound came from heaven or some other earthly hijinks, the Lord would eventually let them know either way. It wasn't long before the knocking sound progressed and the Blaisdell family began hearing the voice of a woman coming from their cellar. Always upon check-in, they found no trace of intruder or hoaxer. As December turned into January and the new year passed, these peculiar visitations progressed a step further, leading to ghostly apparitions of a woman shrouded in white standing in the cellar and openly conversing with the Blaisdell family. This ghostly visage claimed to be the spirit of Nelly Butler, the very same Franklin woman, daughter of David and Joanna Hooper and wife of George Butler, deceased almost 3 years prior. This apparition appeared at first only to the Blaisdell family, but news like this spreads quickly in a small town, and Nelly had some big plans that would require the belief of more than just the Blaisdells. For some time, possibly up to 2 years prior to the appearance of Nelly Butler's ghost in the cellar, Lydia Blaisdell and George Butler had been developing something of a relationship that appeared to be leaning towards courtship. This was opposed by Abner Blaisdell, who took some disagreement with the 29-year-old man knocking about with his 15-year-old daughter. Commonly, we see in history women marrying at far younger ages than today. However, this was not the case in Maine in the late 1700s, and 15 was still unusually young, not to mention that the age gap of the pair exacerbated matters. After conversing with the ghost in late December, its disembodied voice flitting around the cellar from corner to corner, Abner now saw a change of heart. Nelly Butler, it seemed, not only condoned the marriage, but ordered it must happen. It was her divine mission. The parties must and would be joined, and what God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. Who was he to stand in the way of God's will? On January the 1st, the ghost ordered Abner and Lydia to go and visit Moses Butler, father of George, to deliver her message that she wished the pair wed. The message was to be delivered alongside a verse from Scripture, Mark 10, and specifically the lines, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." Lydia and her father made the perilous journey to Franklin in a terrific snowstorm, crossing the precarious ice sheets of the frozen Taunton River. Along the journey, Lydia became upset. Apparently she too was not overly keen on the concept of marriage, especially one ordered from beyond the grave. However, Nelly appeared to her, consoling her and spurring her forwards through the storm. When they arrived at the house of Moses Butler, they were told in no uncertain terms that their journey had been in vain. Moses was himself also stoutly against the union. Abner insisted that it was the will of his deceased daughter-in-law, and that they came with her message, that the spirit had travelled with them, and if they wished a miracle as further proof, that they should wish it and it would happen. As one might imagine, this went down about as well as a redcoat in Boston, and the pair were sent away, leaving Moses Butler in a state of disgust. As the minutes and hours after their departure passed, however, he began having second thoughts. Why would Abner come all this way in such poor weather conditions, essentially risking his life to strike a proposal for a marriage that he himself had opposed for so long? Lydia and her father returned home only in time to hear once again the familiar knocking coming from the cellar, announcing the arrival of Nelly Butler in their home. This time, Nelly wanted the messengers to go and see David Hooper, her own father and father-in-law to George Butler, to arrange for him to come and see her spirit for himself. Not overly thrilled at having to trek another 6 miles in a snowstorm so soon after returning, the pair left it until the next morning to carry out Nelly's latest orders. And so on the morning of January the 2nd, Lydia and Abner Blaisdell stepped out into the harsh winter weather once more to make the journey to the home of David Hooper in Franklin. This time, their expedition was successful, and David Hooper agreed to visit the Blaisdell residence later that day to confirm the identity of his daughter. They also visited George Butler at the same time, delivering the same message and inviting him also to visit his deceased wife in their cellar. Upon their meeting with the apparition of Nelly Butler, we have the written testimony given by both men that show their conviction and belief with what they saw, and that it was indeed what Abner had described as the ghost of their deceased relative. By the request of the spectre sent by 2 messengers, I went to Abner Blaisdell's house, and by conversing with she, obtained such clear and irresistible tokens of her being the spirit of my own daughter as gave me no less satisfaction than admiration and delight. She gave a reason satisfactory to me why she put me to the trouble of coming there instead of her coming to my house. The testimony of George Butler, who showed up at the Blaisdell home shortly after David Hooper had finished conversing with the spirit, proceeds much along the same lines. When I was called to talk with this voice, I asked, "Who are you?" It answered, "I was once your wife." The voice asked me, "Do you remember what I told you when I was alive?" I answered, "I do not really know what you mean." The voice said, "Do you not remember I told you I did not think I should live long with you? I told you that if you were to leave me, I should never wish to change my condition, but if I was to leave you, I could not blame you if you did. This passed between me and my first wife while she was alive, and there was no living person within hearing but she and myself, and I am sure that this was never revealed to any person, and no living person could have told it to me before the voice did. There was something appeared to my view right before me, like a person in a winding sheet, and her arms folded under the winding sheet, and on her arm there appeared to be a very small child. By this appearance I did not know possibly, but I might be deceived. I reached out my left hand to take hold of it. I saw my hand in the middle of it, but could feel nothing. The same evening, it appeared and disappeared to me 3 times. In his own testimony, Frederick Houseoff, who apparently visited along with George, confirmed that he had seen George Butler place his hand on the apparition of Nelly Butler and saw his hand pass through it. David Hooper took his experience at the Blaisdell home and his meeting with the deceased directly to Moses Butler, where he confirmed the truth to him, that the ghost of Nelly Butler had arisen in the cellar of the Blaisdell home, that he had spoken to it, and that its wish was a divine order for the marriage of Lydia Blaisdell to George Butler. And so, with a heavy sigh, Moses Butler resigned to the inevitable. After all, who was he to stand in the way of God's will? On the 5th of January, he set off towards Franklin to inform Abner that he would give the marriage his blessing. With both fathers now reluctantly on board, and it was with some reluctance, Abner apparently still treated George Butler with a level of disdain. All that was left to take care of was the marriage date, which was quickly set up to take place on Butler's Point on May the 29th, 1800. As soon as the marriage was made public, dissenting voices began to appear. There were many in the local town that thought Lydia was attempting to dupe George Butler into marrying her, whilst others mulled over the possibility that necromancy was at play, and the spirit was nothing more than a demon or demon familiar. When Sally Wentworth, Nelly's sceptical sister, visited the Blaisdell home on January the 3rd, along with her husband Moses Wentworth and George Butler, she said of the spirit, "We heard the sound of knocking. Lydia spoke, and a voice answered, the sound of which brought fresh to my mind that of my sister's own voice, in an instant, but I could not understand it at all, though it was within the compass of my embrace, and had it been a creature which breathed, it would have breathed in my face. I passed through the room which led to the cellar into another room, and there I was much surprised when I plainly understood by the same kind of voice, still speaking in the cellar, these words, 'I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness.' From this time, I cleared Lydia as the voice and accused the devil." It was an opinion she would hold until her dying day. Her voice, she said, sounded like the voice of her sister not in health, but whilst she lay on her deathbed. On the same day, Captain Paul Simpson visited the cellar to witness the ghost on insistence by Paul Blaisdell, one of the Blaisdell sons. As was becoming customary by now, they went down into the cellar, put out the dim candlelight and waited for the knocks. Nelly rapped as expected, and when Paul spoke to her, she replied the same words as those she spoke to Sally earlier that day. "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Prepare ye the way of the Lord. Make his paths straight. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near." One might think that a ghostly visitation might conjure up a degree of fear in a superstitious population like that of Sullivan in 1800, but it seemed Nelly had a certain way with words. After a little discourse with her, their fears were entirely dissipated and succeeded by a singular pleasure, so delightful was the mode of her address and conversation. In fact, Nelly would routinely reassure visitors to fear not, and Abraham Cummings, a travelling evangelist, theorised in a later letter on the subject that he believed the reason Nelly would knock to announce her presence, like that of a visitor to her front door, or of only answering once spoken to, was to avoid startling anyone. This measure of thoughtfulness extended further, according to Cummings, being also the reason Nelly would generally only appear in the cellar, to allow the Blaisdell family to retreat to their homely, comfortable rooms at will, without fear of a haunted spirit rudely gate-crashing their private chambers of rest and relaxation. In general, this was a courtesy observed fairly faithfully by the spirit. However, she did also appear in other spots around Sullivan on a handful of occasions, visiting houses as far as 5 miles from Blaisdell's farm. Her apparitions, however, were not always indoors. Paul Blaisdell testified to seeing the spirit in the fields around the Blaisdell house in the latter half of January. "I particularly observed that she never touched the ground. Her raiment appeared as white as possible. The next evening she reproved me in the hearing of several persons because I had not spoken to her, because I had spoken against her. She told me she had come on God's errand and that, if I opposed her, I opposed him who sent her. The spirit asked me if I lived in such a manner as I would wish to die." In the 5 months between ordering the marriage of Lydia Blaisdell and George Butler until the day of the union, news of the spirit began to spill from Sullivan Harbour and spread around the local towns. People would come from the many townships dotted around Hancock County to see the apparition of Nelly Butler, gathering in the Blaisdell's cellar, crammed in to see what all the fuss was about. She routinely conversed with visitors for upwards of 2 or 3 hours at a time on all manner of topics. Not all of the visitors were so readily willing to believe, however, and many who came to see the events for themselves were either sceptical of any spiritual activity full stop, or were actively hostile to the idea of a ghostly apparition, suspicious that it might be some kind of demon or demon familiar, conjured up by a form of necromancy or witchcraft by Lydia. There were other voices too within the town that suspected Lydia of a rather more straightforward, earthly-based deception in order to ensnare George Butler into a communion, and they were growing louder by the day. As for Lydia, she herself still held her own reservations which she recounted to friends, and culminated in her machinations to run away before the marriage could take place. The Blaisdells had relatives in York, and she devised a plan to jump a ship docked in Taunton Bay to go and stay with these distant family members. She told George of the plan, breaking off any relationship they once had and their current engagement. George, who by now was very much behind the idea of marriage to the young Lydia, protested this idea, but it was no good. It would take a whole lot more to keep her in Franklin, and a whole lot more is what she got. Nelly Butler's ghost spoke to Lydia in front of several witnesses, urging her to stay and insisting that if she were to sail, her afflictions would sail with her. It would all be for naught. And so, as the spirit wished, Lydia Blaisdell and George Butler were married on the 29th of May. The two families gathered on Butler's Point to carry out the union. With their wishes fulfilled, the ghost of Nelly Butler may well have shrunk off into the corners of an unspoken history, spurned on only by rumours and the hearsay of the local townsfolk. Nelly, however, was only just getting started.